One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
Dead, buried, cremated.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared.
The treasurer.
Australia's basically done for. We'll just end up being a third-rate economy. You know, a banana republic.
How good is Australia?
Just follow the money.
G'day and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast demystifying the big economic issues in Australia and putting them in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Institute, and this was recorded live on Wednesday, the 25th of November 2020. We were going to do a separate podcast on the new electric vehicles tax, but we also held a Snap webinar today, recorded live, and it really covered everything that we were going to talk about and probably in much more detail. So electric vehicles have been a hot topic in these past few weeks, with a number of Australian states proposing new taxes on electric vehicles. As part of the state budget, South Australia revealed plans to tax electric vehicle drivers with a road user charge based on distance travelled. New South Wales has signalled its intentions to follow suit, and Victoria has announced similar measures in its state budget as well.
A showdown is looming over a controversial plan to tax electric car use on South Australian roads.
The backlash over the tax on electric car owners continues with the
It fears the charge will turn people off environmentally friendly transport.
State government wants to be the first to charge owners for the distance they drive as well.
The government says the tax is in place of the fuel excise charged to other motorists.
I think most people appreciate that those people that use our roads in South Australia need to make a contribution.
At the very time that other jurisdictions around the world are subsidising electric vehicles, Stephen Marshall wants to tax them.
The UK, France and China are planning to ban or limit sales of new vehicles with internal combustion engines in the next couple of decades.
What the government shouldn't be doing is telling people what sort of cars they should drive.
We are going to stand by our tradies and we are going to save their utes.
It's a war on the weekend.
For me, it's about getting more people in green cars.
It will be taking South Australia in the wrong direction and slamming the brakes on EV uptake in the state.
The Australia Institute views these new electric vehicle taxes as backwards and unnecessary that contradict supposed state government commitments to increase the uptake of electric vehicles in the future. A report released today by the Australia Institute's Nordic Policy Centre shows that governments around the world are preparing for the transition to EVs. 17 national governments have announced targets to phase out the sale of new fossil-fuelled vehicles altogether. Norway is the most ambitious of these, with its goal to end fossil fuel vehicle sales by 2025. Not that far away. And that's backed up by effective policies and incentives. Australia is really falling very far behind. Some of the questions we've been receiving from our supporters recently are about transport infrastructure funding and asking questions like, doesn't fuel tax pay for road maintenance? They also realise that the Australia Institute has been pretty pro-tax in the past. And so we're getting a lot of questions that we'll unpack in this webinar, so please stay tuned. Today, you'll hear from Tim Washington, the founder and director of JetCharge, Australia's largest EV charging infrastructure business. JetCharge is also a co-founder of ChargeFox, Australia's largest EV charging network. Tim is also the chair of the Electric Vehicle Council, which is the peak body for electric vehicle industry in Australia. And joining Tim is the Australia Institute's Chief Economist, Richard Dennis, our Climate and Energy Program Director, Richie Merzian, and Climate and Energy Researcher, Audrey Quicke. Welcome to you all. Thank you so much for joining us. Tim, I'll start with you. Can you just tell us about these latest electric vehicle tax announcements and what they're going to do to the electric vehicle market in Australia, and give us a big picture idea of where the EV market is up to?
Yeah, and I think big picture is exactly where we should start, because the picture is not very big. It's tiny. Typically when governments go about looking at tax, from my experience, they definitely look at the kind of pool of assets or sources that they will tax. If you look at the pool of electric vehicles, we have something like under 20,000 electric cars in Australia. So no matter what tax you're levying on these vehicles, it's not going to bring in much income. And so the question then is, why would state governments go about spending political capital, trying to get something like this through when it's not going to really make much of a difference to the budget? So that's kind of the big picture in terms of how much revenue it's going to bring. It's going to bring hardly anything at all. About 1 million forecast for South Australia, 30 million forecast for Victoria, although I think that's ambitious. But, considering how much we're spending in the budget, it is like less than a drop in the ocean. And so, but it does three things to electric. It disincentivizes electric vehicle uptake for three reasons. The first is nobody likes to pay more for things. And so therefore, if you make something more expensive, tax acts as a disincentive. As you say, sometimes that's okay because that is a price we pay for a civilized society. But in this particular case, as we'll hear today, most likely it's not okay. The second two reasons are probably more qualitative than quantitative. So the second reason is administration. People don't like hassle. People don't like to do things, especially when an equivalent thing can be done with less hassle. So if you're shopping for an electric car, not for environmental reasons, but just because you want the latest, Nissan Leaf, or you want the latest Hyundai or MG or whatever, the fact that it's more expensive already, then you have to pay for road user charge. And then you either have to, at best, report your ODO reading at the Rego office, or at worst have GPS tracking. That extra administration really hurts. And you go, oh, well, I can't be bothered. That's especially true for fleet managers. Corporate sales of vehicles in Australia make up almost 50% of all vehicle sales. Fleet managers who already have a lot on their plate look at an EV, for example. They go, okay, it's more expensive. Maybe we can get some money back through total cost of ownership through fuel savings and maintenance savings. But I have to keep these really strict administrative things, whereas I don't have to do that with a Camry hybrid. Well, why would I buy an electric vehicle? So fleet managers, so administration is a big factor. And the third thing is, in a country where we're already struggling with model availability in Australia, like we don't have anywhere near the number of EVs that are offered overseas. This sends a signal to vehicle manufacturers globally that Australia is not a good place to send your vehicles, especially when they can sell it so much easier in almost any other developed jurisdiction, including Europe, China, and the US. And so we already don't get the models we need. And of the models that we do get, we already don't get the numbers that we need. And so something like this will just basically make it really hard for the local subsidiaries to make the business case that they should bring electric vehicles here, which obviously means that it decreases choice for us and puts us years behind in being able to have an affordable EV market. So I guess that's like a very rough overview of the effect that this is going to have.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. And we'll come back to you, I think, for more of those kind of the details of why this policy is so bad in particular. But Richard, I'll come to you next. I did mention that we've had a lot of feedback about people a bit confused. The Australian Institute has really advocated for taxation as being an important policy tool, and a lot of questions around, well, don't we need to pay for road maintenance and things? Economically speaking, why is this EV tax a bad idea?
Oh, well, personally, I think it's a bad idea because my personal opinion is having more electric cars on the road is a good thing. And one of the main principles of designing a good tax system is you tax things you want to discourage and you subsidise things you want to encourage. It's not complicated. We might disagree as humans about what we want to encourage and what we want to discourage. But, for example, we tax tobacco because we're trying to discourage people from smoking. Now, as the number of people smoking declines, we don't usually panic and say, oh, it's bad for the budget. We usually say, oh, it's working. Our policy is working. So the way that we're framing this up is, oh no, a small number of people had started to buy electric cars and we want to encourage electric cars, but that's going to cost us some revenue in the future. So let's start taxing the thing that our public statements and other parts of our public policy are trying to encourage. So no, tax isn't bad, but for example, we how do we maintain our public parks? Should we have turnstiles at the public parks and have a pay to play? Or do we fund our public parks through consolidated revenue, through revenue collected broadly? So sometimes we impose specific taxes on specific things, sometimes, but not usually. Usually what we do is we collect a lot of revenue from things that we think are good at collecting revenue, and we spend it on things we want. Now, a lot of people believe that all of the money from fuel excise, for example, gets spent on roads. So if you're not paying any fuel excise, you're not funding the road. Let me just choose my words carefully. That's nonsense. There is absolutely no link, none, just to leave any room for ambiguity, none, between how much you drive your car and how much excise you pay and how much the government spends on a road near you or indeed anywhere. So this idea that excise funds roads, so therefore if you're driving on the road, you're not paying excise, you're getting a free deal, it's simply not true. Now, if, and it's a giant if the government, state or federal, was interested in genuine transport reform, if we were going to start from scratch and say what's a fair way to, fund roads or what's a fair way to collect tax, maybe some sort of user charge for electric vehicles would be part of that. But the first thing you do, the absolute first thing you do, would be to introduce what's called mass distance charging on heavy trucks. For 20 years, economists, a productivity commission, countless reviews have pointed out that a truck does literally 20,000 times as much damage, 20,000 times as much damage to a road as a normal passenger vehicle. So trucks do an enormous amount of damage to the roads, but in Australia, we don't recoup the cost of all that damage from the truck companies. New Zealand does, for example, and the Productivity Commission in Australia has been saying for decades that's what we should do. So if we wanted to kind of tax road use fairly, we would be collecting billions of dollars in additional revenue from big trucks each year, but that would mean confronting serious political power. And while the fuel excise that I pay when I go to the petrol station, while that fuel excise has been increasing with inflation, we've actually lowered the excise for heavy vehicles, and heavy vehicles already pay lower excise than you and me. So there is no link, none, between the amount of tax you pay at the petrol pump, I pay more per litre than a giant truck, and the amount of road I use up. Trucks do far more damage than me. So the idea that, let's start road pricing reform over here with this nascent electric vehicle industry, it's a symbolic act that will have a big detrimental effect on a very small slice of the market. But to suggest fairness compels us to do it is ridiculous. We'd start with trucks if we cared about fairness. And to suggest revenue compels us to do it is ridiculous because there's not enough cars on the road, as Tim said, to collect a lot of revenue.
Thanks, Richard. I think that's really laid it out quite neatly. Richie, I might come to you next. Can you just give us an idea of where electric vehicle policy is in Australia at the moment? Set the scene for us there.
Sure. Well, just to continue from Richard's comments, there is none. We have nothing. There is no national electric vehicle policy, which is maybe why the states are launching these ad hoc approaches and why we have this discoordinated approach. Transport emissions have been going up since Australia signed the UN Framework Convention in 92. In fact, almost by, 65%. They make up almost 1/5 of our emissions nationally, and we don't have a single policy to curb that downwards. The only benefit to transport emissions was the fact that we've been flying less and driving less because of the pandemic. That's the best policy we have. So we're still waiting on a national electric vehicle policy. It was promised last year. Then it was moved to mid this year. Now it's moved to the end of this year. Then it went from an EV policy to an EV discussion paper. Now a future fuels discussion paper. So not even just focused on EVs. And this is part of a bigger issue at the federal government level. We have some of the worst fuel efficiency standards in the entire OECD. Maybe something that Matthias Cormann can correct when he heads it up. Who knows? But right now, Australians pay more to just go the same distance than anyone in Europe or the US or in New Zealand. And that is because it's been in a ministerial forum led by the Deputy Prime Minister for the last 7 years, and it hasn't gone anywhere. On top of that, we have a fuel security issue. So a national security issue when it comes to our liquid fuels. And that's been sitting in a liquid fuel security review run by Angus Taylor, which hasn't released its results. Instead, they've just come up with these ad hoc solutions. So we'd rather send a warship to the Middle East to protect our fuel stocks rather than looking at ways to reduce our demand. So there's all these policy gaps in how we address transport, and specifically EVs, and that's creating a lot of chaos, a lack of coordination, and certainly a lack of incentives, which is why we've also seen a relatively low uptake of EV compared to our counterparts.
Audrey, I'll come to you next. You've written a couple of reports now on electric vehicle policy, particularly looking at Norway as one of the world leaders. Can you tell us a little bit about what's in the report that came out today and why we look to Norway for policy inspiration?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, we had Christina Boo, who's the head of the Norwegian Electric Vehicle Association, on one of our past webinars here. And she summed up the Norwegian approach in a very similar way to what you did just then, Richard, where she said that we basically tax what we don't want and we incentivize what we do. And that is the crux of the Norwegian approach to electric vehicle policy. They do that in a number of ways, so I might just outline a couple of those. Firstly, they've got a bunch of policies that reduce the upfront cost of the electric vehicles. So the big one there is that they're exempt from the registration tax. So in Norway, you pay this one-off registration tax on imported vehicles, and that fee is calculated based on, firstly, the vehicle's weight, then the vehicle's carbon emissions, and also its nitrogen oxide emissions. So an average internal combustion engine vehicle there will pay about 30% of its import price in this registration tax. For EVs, you don't pay it at all, completely waived. For something like a plug-in hybrid, you're going to pay a lot less than a big emitting fossil vehicle. Secondly, there's an exemption on GST. So in Norway, you pay 25% GST, which is charged on the purchase of a vehicle, and zero emissions vehicles are again completely exempt from that tax. And we know that these two policies are really important because they reduce that upfront cost. And as consumers, that's what we really are concerned about, that sticker price. That's what is going to change our decision whether we do or don't purchase that vehicle. Then there are also policies that reduce the operating cost of electric vehicles. So there's a reduction in the circulation tax as well. So previously in Norway, the vehicles paid this annual fee to operate on public roads. Again, this was waived or reduced for electric vehicles. And then we also see this reduction in toll, ferry and parking fees for electric vehicles. So these ones are lowered at the discretion of local municipalities. So they do differ throughout Norway. But generally, they're always going to be at least half of what a fossil fuel vehicle pays to access those same things. We also see access incentives. So we see access to bus lanes and dedicated parking spots in Norway. And that's supported by this rollout of electric vehicle number plates, so you can easily tell which one's an electric vehicle, which one isn't, and that sort of thing. Then there's also public charging infrastructure. So the Norwegian government actually supported the rollout of fast charging points across the country. And I think apart from 2 cities now, fast charging stations have successfully been established every 50 kilometres on main roads across the whole of the country. And that was under a government scheme, basically, where up to 100% of those installation costs were covered by the government. So particularly in rural areas, and then slightly less than 100% in some of those cities like Oslo. So that's the bulk of the incentives that are offered to EV drivers in Norway. And the end result of this package is basically that in Norway, electric vehicles do cost a similar amount to fossil-fueled vehicles. So, for instance, the electric Golf is actually cheaper than the ICE Golf. And driving and parking is cheaper and it's more accessible to EV drivers. So in the paper that we launched today, as Ebony mentioned, we talk about this goal by the Norwegian government to phase out all new fossil fuel vehicles by 2025. And because of this package of incentives, they're well on their way to actually achieving that, which is pretty exciting. 5 years away. It's the most ambitious goal of its kind in the world.
Thanks, Audrey. Tim, I might come back to you because you're also, as I mentioned in the introduction, a business owner who's operating in the electric vehicle market.
what opportunities are there for the Australian market, and what would it look like if, by some miracle, the federal government decided to back electric vehicles and announced a really great policy tomorrow?
Yeah, sure. Look, when I first started the business 7 years ago, EV uptake, EV sales were at 0.01%, I think. They're now 7 years later at 0.6%, so go us. But I think really from a business perspective, I'm more interested in creating an industry out of a once in several generation shift. I think most people who don't do this every day don't realize how significant it is for an entire transport class to move fuel source from one fuel to another fuel, and for all of that fueling resource to be onshore. That is a once in several generation change. It's also why countries are going so hard on this. It's because it brings a level of security, but also innovation opportunity to kind of onshore. All of the best EV businesses and EV charging businesses globally come from countries that have supportive policies around EVs. And that's a pretty kind of like obvious thing to say, right? Like if you're coming out of university and you're thinking about your next startup and what you want to do, and everyone is telling you EVs are a thing, the government's supportive, the domestic market is supportive, that makes you far more likely to do something like that, or to join companies that have a mandate that have something to do with EVs. In Australia, no offense, I always pick on them, no offense to mattress companies, but you're far more likely to start a mattress company than you are to start a company in EVs. And there's something wrong with that, because mattresses are cool, but a once in several generation opportunity should be better. So as a business, it's really disappointing. Look, we've got like 40 people working in a market that is 0.6%. The opportunity is absolutely massive, but we're just not seeing the kind of support that we thought we would. And even in the absence of support, at least we could count on no disincentives, right? And now that's come along. And what's really disappointing for us is that actually governments have been sending really mixed messages. Like Jet Charge is funded in part by the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, which is a federal initiative, right? So we are government supported in that part. State governments have said we're going to fund charging infrastructure. And we're going to transition fleets to electric. And so you go, okay, and they're going to do electric bus trials. So they go, okay, well, you do want to see EV, so then why this tax? And the real reason, and I think Richard can cover this as well, the reason why the public perception is so confusing is because this road user charge actually has nothing to do with EVs. It actually has nothing to do with EVs. It's because fuel excise is a federal tax, but state road user charge is a state tax. And it's simply a way to transfer funds from the federal government to the state governments, which is why you see the government that's actually responsible for the fuel excise, the federal government, not coming out and saying, hey, we need to do something about this. It's actually the state governments coming out and saying something like that. And EVs are just a really easy target. But unfortunately, even though EVs are a really easy target, it destroys an entire industry before we've been able to get things off the ground. And it puts us at least 5 years behind if this comes in. And it means that companies like ours, who have to compete globally for our technology, for our business, we're just not in a supportive environment. And I think that will hurt us.
Richard, I'll come back to you. Very famously, the Treasurer and Prime Minister, Tony Abbott and Joe Hockey, basically goaded the car industry to just get out of Australia, and they did. Just taking us kind of back to that big picture economically, we don't actually have a domestic car industry anymore that has to retool or rechange its focus or anything like that. We can't hurt any kind of domestic car industry. That used to be one of the chief reasons why we couldn't move in this direction. But where are we now? Are we risking that Australia becomes the dumping ground for like the most gas-guzzling cars in the world?
Oh, look, absolutely. But, let's be clear, we already drive the second biggest, second dumbest cars in the world. Part of stimulating the economy has been to subsidise tradies to go out and buy an enormous number of imported, very big, very expensive utes, as if that's a way to stimulate the Australian economy. as you said, Australia used to have a car manufacturing industry, and back before everything was about jobs, this same government, the coalition government elected in 2013, literally kind of dared the Australian car manufacturers to leave. Mission accomplished. They left. Now here we are, 7 years later, and they're saying the reason we have to protect coal mines is because we care about jobs. No, they don't. They've never cared about jobs. They didn't care about jobs with free trade agreements. They didn't care about jobs with manufacturing going offshore. And they certainly don't care about jobs when they think that encouraging people to buy imported utes is a great way to stimulate the Australian economy. So, look, where are we? Unfortunately, like everything, I fear, in Australia, and sort of anything to do with fossil fuels is just part of a culture war. You have to pick a team, and you either are for the future or for the past. You're not allowed to be for efficiency. You're not allowed to be for sensible foreign policy. You're not allowed to be. You just have to pick a team. So, remember only the election, a bit over 12 months ago, electric vehicles were going to ruin our weekends. This is kind of how backwards and crazy the Australian debate is. So, look, where are we now? As Tim said, we've got less than 1% of new vehicles being purchased in Australia being electric vehicles, less than 1%. Just as the whole world is going to move away from buying our coal, the rest of the world is going to move away from internal combustion engines. And if we're last to the party, that won't be the end of the world. It'll just mean that vehicles in Australia are more expensive than vehicles driven elsewhere, more polluting, and also it's going to take us longer to catch up with the kind of infrastructure that Tim and others are trying to roll out. So most of the world is embracing the future. Funny that. Australia's like King Canute trying to hold back the tide with a broom. It won't work, but we can waste a lot of time, and we can waste a lot of other people's money, and we can waste a lot of effort, and more importantly, miss out on a lot of opportunities to actually participate in what is going to be one of the biggest shifts in the economy this century. We're just missing out by denying reality.
Thanks, Richard. We might go now to questions, because there's already about 50 questions up here ready to go. But I just really, again, want to thank you all for coming along today. We've got about 625 people on this webinar, and we only started advertising it yesterday. So that's a pretty massive response. Thank you all for coming along. I've got some comments in the chat asking what people can do to pressure governments. The Australian Institute has a petition that I've put up a link to. I believe there's another one called stopthecleanairtax.org.au that you can sign as well. There's links for that in the chat. We'll try to put those links up with this video as well. But at the moment, these are state government taxes. So I'd be getting in touch with the Treasurer and Premier of South Australia, Victoria and New South Wales. I think the ACT has ruled it out, and they've got a pretty good policy, but might also be worth, if you're in WA, Queensland, or one of the other states that haven't canvassed this, just getting in touch to tell them what a terrible idea it is as well.
Ebony, I might jump in and say this is absolutely a coordinated action among the state treasurers. There is, you don't see announcements like this in succession without coordination. So even the states that haven't announced it, I strongly encourage everyone to write to their local representatives, and let's get some voices out there before they announce it.
Absolutely. So I'm going to start with a question that someone actually sent in before the webinar. It's from David in Adelaide, and I think it's a question a lot of people will want the answer to. What is the best way to reply to your uncle at Christmas lunch when he says EV drivers have to contribute their share towards road maintenance like every other driver? Richard, I'll come to you first, and then maybe to you, Tim.
Look, I'd start with, if we're really worried about road maintenance, we should be worried about trucks. Like it's not ideology, it's physics. It's something called the fourth power rule. When you double the weight of a vehicle, it does 16 times as much damage to the road. So enormous trucks literally do thousands of times more damage than your car. So if your uncle's really worried about road maintenance, he should be really worried about the fact that each night 3,000 semi-trailers drive between Sydney and Melbourne on roads. 20% of the freight used to be on trains. It's now around 2%. So Australia's subsidised access to roads that we give to trucks is causing enormous damage. It's actually causing a lot of loss of life and a lot of diesel particulate pollution. So, if your uncle's serious, and he's probably not if he's drunk at Christmas, we all know that, but if he's serious about fair road funding for road maintenance, you start with the hundreds of thousands of heavy vehicles in Australia that don't pay nearly enough. That, in fact, maybe make the point, they don't pay as much fuel excise per litre as your uncle does. So I'd start the conversation there. And then ask, why does he think that, of all the people we chose to sort of start the reform with, rather than start with something around heavy vehicles, rather than start with taking the GST off public transport, rather than start with encouraging your uncle to drive a more fuel-efficient vehicle or get himself an electric vehicle, why did we start with a tax on electric vehicles? And the answer is because in Australia, we aim tax and pain at small powerless groups. We're not too worried that the oil companies don't pay any tax. We're not too worried that the big trucks don't pay much tax. But boy, some people bought electric vehicles and they're getting a free ride. Let's stop them. This has got nothing to do with the economics of roads and everything to do with the symbolism of Australian politics.
Thanks, Richard. Tim, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I've got a very simple answer, which is that EV drivers do pay for road maintenance. So when they ask you why shouldn't they pay, the answer is they do pay. And if you wanted to have props, you can preload a federal government website that says fuel excise goes into general revenue along with everything else and is not hypothecated to road maintenance. And I think you lose a lot of people when you talk about stuff like that. So it's much easier to say, no, they do pay for roads because they pay tax and road maintenance is paid for out of general revenue. And so that has to be the answer. One of the things that has been really clever by all the state treasurers, and in fact, it's part of their implementation strategy, is to, as much as possible, emphasize the link between fuel excise and road maintenance. And you've seen that in every single thing that they've put out. They said they have to pay for road maintenance. It is an absolute lie, just like Richard has said. And I can't believe they're getting away with it. And so we need to break that link because that link simply does not exist. So the truth is the right answer in this particular instance, I think.
Thanks, Tim. The next question is from Shamark. They say, looking at this from a long-term perspective, could one make the argument that subsidising EVs now could result in resistance in the future to tax road users when we do get that massive shift to electric vehicles? Could this tax be reasonable in anticipation of some of this resistance down the track? Richie, I might come to you on that one and then maybe you, Audrey.
So the theory is tax them now when they're small and weak because it might be a bit harder to tax them further down the track when they're more powerful, which kind of just feeds into this entire reasoning that this is the right time to do it. But we're taxing something that we want. If you're serious about taxing or actually going after the revenue that's lost, I think a good example is looking at the other fossil fuels. So Australia imports 90% of its liquid fuels, right? So there's no even interest in Australia protecting the fossil fuel, liquid fuel-based industries. But if we look at gas as a good example, most multinational gas companies pay no tax in Australia, even though Australia is the largest exporter of liquefied natural gas. You compare that to a country like Qatar that exports about the same amount of LNG. They make over 20 billion per annum on their LNG. Australia makes a little bit over $1 billion. And that's because a lot of that profit, a lot of that revenue is shifted overseas. And so if you're looking at where the tax loopholes are, then there's much bigger players that you can go after if that's your serious concern. But trying to squeeze it out of a small group of EVs definitely seems like it's aiming the wrong way.
Yeah. Audrey, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, well, also that you're not going to get much money out of them if you do it now as well. I mean, as Tim has outlined, there's just not enough there to be getting any revenue from them. But also, I would just add that in Norway, they are looking at some schemes to introduce road user charges there, but in a very different way. So in Norway, they're looking around the idea that a road user charge should vary based on that vehicle's environmental footprint, how heavy the vehicle is, where it's driving, so the population density, and also the time that it's driving. So is it rush hour? So the road user charges that they might be implementing there are going to reflect those external costs of that car being on that road network. So that's congestion costs, it's accidents, it's noise, road wear, pollution. Whereas what we're seeing here doesn't address these external costs. In fact, it does quite the opposite by singling out clean vehicles and taxing them.
And Ebony, can I just add, like it's an incredibly pernicious neoliberal idea that the tax system is all about spending little bits of money, like getting little bits of money from one thing and spending it on something else. Like we spend a lot of money on Indigenous welfare because we need to. We don't usually say, so what's the fair way to tax Indigenous people so we can spend some money helping their kids? We spend a lot of money on disabled people. We don't usually say, so what's the fair way to tax disabled people so that we can spend money on disabled people? These things have nothing in common. What we do in a big, rich, developed country like Australia is we collect revenue from places that it's good to collect revenue from, and we spend money on things that it's good to spend money on. And there's no link between them. Now, sometimes it's good to collect money from something because we actually want to discourage its use. So again, tobacco, alcohol, petroleum, fossil fuel, we're trying to discourage. It makes sense to tax something. But the fact that you collect money from alcohol doesn't mean you then go spend that money on health. And that you collect money from tobacco as tobacco revenue declines doesn't mean we spend less on health, because the two have nothing to do with each other. So we collect tax in good ways that help us achieve our objectives, and we spend money in good ways that help us achieve our objectives. And yeah, forcing this link between the two is a very kind of a neoliberal bookkeeperish approach to economics and democracy. It's just literally not how the world, the economy, the budget, or democracy is supposed to work.
Yeah,
I think that's a really good point, Richard. Sorry, Ebony, to jump in.
Go ahead.
That's exactly right. And I think what we all have to recognise is that if we were talking about wholesale road user reform in replacement of fuel excise, that is a completely different thing, right? And so you do have jurisdictions like the IPA points out, right? You do have jurisdictions around the world that have introduced road user charges. What they don't say is that those jurisdictions also have very strong corresponding incentives for electric vehicles to encourage their use, because they recognise that adoption of low-emission vehicles is good for the environment and also good for the economy. And so that's really, really important. So at the EV Council, we're not saying, no, you can never have a road user charge as part of EVs. We're just saying it has to be part of a more holistic conversation and don't single out EVs. But what they're doing is not this holistic conversation. What they're doing is a staged approach to capture more and more revenue over time. So what they're using EVs with its low user base and low opposition to implement the administrative capabilities to collect road user charge. And then in 2 years' time, they'll come after hybrids, of course, because they're very fuel efficient. Then they'll come after fuel efficient engines before capturing everything. They're going this transitional approach, which I think is actually quite cynical. And really, they've had the opportunity to tackle a more holistic approach, and they have chosen not to do that because they think this is the path of least resistance. And we need to show them that there is going to be resistance to this path.
The next question, just quickly, I've just posted a link. Richard Dennis has written an op-ed in The Guardian today. That's up online now, and I've just posted a link to that. The next question is from Simon Corbell, and he says, this issue does raise the broader context of revenues in a decarbonised economy, where significant revenue streams from resources extraction like coal royalties as well as exports will disappear over time. Do we need to discuss what our revenues look like in a decarbonised world as a whole, including transport and fuel levies? Richard, I'll come to you on that one.
Oh, look, absolutely. And, let's go to the Henry tax review. Could we have a carbon price? Yes, please. Could we have a mining tax? Yes, please. Are you worried that those sources of revenue will go in 10 or 20 years' time? Maybe. Okay, how about a super profits tax on the banks? Oh, we've already got one. It's just not very big. How about a tax on Google and Facebook? How about we actually look at how the gig economy is emerging and how there's enormous holes in the whole tax bucket now, thanks to these technological changes? What if Australia wasn't one of the only rich countries in the world to have no estate duties, no death taxes? I'd much prefer to pay tax when I'm dead than when I'm alive. What about the $40,000 million a year we spend on tax concessions for super, which help me a lot, thank you very much, and do nothing to help low-income women in their retirement, nothing at all. So as luck would have it, we're one of the richest countries in the world, and despite COVID, we're still living in an enormously prosperous economy compared to the rest of the world. If we want to collect a lot of revenue, we know how to do that. Australia is one of the lowest taxed countries in the developed world. So, let's have a big debate about revenue. But please, like the Institute's been trying to drive one for years, but let's, again, get out of the neoliberal accountant's box and think that if we're losing some revenue from one part of transport, the thing is we have to increase revenue from another part of transport. So private school fees are exempt from GST, and because hundreds of thousands of kids now go to private school in Australia, the whole GST pie is shrinking. So should we increase the tax I pay on shoes because there's this hole in the GST bucket caused by the trend towards private schools? There's no economic logic behind that at all. So, let's do big picture tax reform. But the idea that we start by putting a tax on something that will discourage people from doing something we want to encourage, for me, very bad economics, bad for the environment, and pretty weird democratic choice.
The next question is from Wendy Rainbird, who asks, would you comment on the ACT's progress on supporting the uptake of electric vehicles? Richie, I might come to you on that one.
Sure. This is the Canberra bubble within the Canberra bubble. The ACT has done quite well in actually incentivizing electric vehicle uptake. It's done that by removing stamp duty on purchases, on reducing registration, and I think more incentives are coming forward under the latest Labor Greens government that was recently elected as well, including maybe 2 years of free rego, I think now on electric vehicles. I know that certainly incentivized me, being a Canberra resident, to purchase an electric vehicle, and I found one secondhand for under 20 grand, which is within my budget to do so. And that's ultimately what these incentives are supposed to do, to drive that uptake. Unfortunately, that doesn't seem to correlate with the states across the border. But really, in the ACT, they want to become the electric vehicle hub, and they're putting a lot of effort and money towards that. And that also includes the infrastructure that goes alongside that. So installing a number of fast charging stations, including ones from Tim's company, I believe, and a few others in Australia too. The ACT doesn't have the range anxiety because it is a small jurisdiction, but it does have a number of opportunities to charge up wherever you end up going.
And Ebony, I would say that this is a perfect example of where a supportive local government drives innovation in the industry sector, because it's no coincidence that one of the most innovative vehicle-to-grid fleet trials in the world is happening in Canberra. It's because it's a collaboration between the state government, the electricity sector, ANU, as well as private sector people like us. And it's doing that because it's in an environment that's supportive of these kind of things. And so out of that, we're going to gain a lot of knowledge, primarily in the ACT, around how we can utilise electric vehicles to support our grid. And that's because they are supportive of EVs. And so there is a direct link there.
Follow up on that, Tim, and ask about that connection to the grid there. People might not be aware of that. What is that, and why is that important?
Yeah, so one of the reasons why electric vehicles will be so important for Australia is not only because of transportation, but it also has to do with lowering electricity bills. It seems to be a favourite kind of phrase for everybody, so I'll use it as well. But essentially what's going to happen is that when you purchase an electric vehicle, it will double as a storage battery. A typical electric vehicle has about 4 times the storage capacity as a Tesla Powerwall. And so what that means is that with the increased penetration of rooftop solar and having an electric vehicle in your driveway or even on the street or shed within your apartment, you are going to be in charge of generating, storing, and distributing electricity in your own home, bringing down electricity costs for everybody. And so when you delay EV uptake like these measures do, not only are you robbing people of lower cost transport, you're also robbing people of lower cost electricity. So it's a double whammy that isn't evident to a lot of people today, but it will be evident going forward.
Ebony, can I just answer a question no one's asked? Thinking about the drunk uncle and the point Tim's just making. It's often sort of suggested that electric vehicles are kind of, causing lots of CO2 emissions because, the electricity for them comes from coal or some portion of, let me just choose my words carefully again, what utter crap. Australia hasn't built a new coal-fired power station in over a decade. Okay, we haven't built any new coal-fired power stations. So guess where all of the new demand for electricity has been met from? From renewables. Okay, so the old coal-fired power stations are falling over despite this new source of demand coming on for the simple reason that all of the new supply that's getting put in is coming from renewables. So the fact that the electric vehicles are also going to be kind of your own portable electricity trading storage potential is just yet another reason why the quicker we do this, the better it is for everyone. Not just less air pollution, not just less CO2, but actually more batteries in a diversified grid that we'll all benefit from. And again, we can put that off for 10 years if we want, and it'll just cost us more and more money, and we'll be further and further behind the rest of the world. Genius.
Can I just wrap that up just with 2 small points? The first is that the ACT is the first jurisdiction outside Europe to go net 100% renewables. And what that means is now that they've dealt with the largest portion of their emissions as a jurisdiction, they can deal with the next one, which is transport. That's why it makes so much sense once you've cleaned up your electricity sector to then work on transport by electrifying that and then plugging it back in. And the second one, just on Richard's point, we have a bit of analysis that's going to be coming out sometime soon, which actually looks at the emissions if you do have an electric vehicle plugged into every different state and territory, and what that would look like using electricity that's the dirtiest, like Victoria's running on brown coal, versus the cleanest, like in Tasmania and Australia. It doesn't matter which jurisdiction you're in, it's still cleaner than the cleanest internal combustion engine vehicle that you have right now in Australia.
That's good to know.
And I also just add to that as well that, so we know that the life cycle CO2 emissions are already cleaner on every grid in Australia, but also research and surveys constantly show that current EV owners in Australia, generally there's this strong relationship there between EV owners and people that have rooftop solar or people that have like electricity power plants that are powered by renewables. But then the same goes for public chargers too. And Tim, you're probably better placed to speak to this, but what are the ChargeFox ultra rapid chargers powered by? It's 100% renewables.
Correct. Yeah, correct. And I'm glad we're kind of talking about the environment as well, because everybody takes it as a given. But I think it's important to point this out in that our fight against climate change cannot succeed without a huge uptake of zero emissions vehicles. Right now, like a lot of the states are committed to, zero emissions by 2050. That assumes 90% EV penetration. Dr. Jake Whitehead at UQ has done a great job on this, right? 90% EV uptake. Federal government's own modelling shows that by 2050, without any additional incentives, we'll probably hit 65%. So what does that tell you? It tells you we need more incentives, not more disincentives to hit our targets. We're not going to get there at this rate. And so it's really important to keep that in mind. It's a key piece of the puzzle.
The next question is from Mark Parnell, MLC. He's a Greens member of the South Australian Parliament, where the first EV tax was proposed. The Greens are obviously opposed to it, but his question is that given many commentators have accepted the likelihood of road user charging in the future, is there merit in supporting a new charge at a low rate for all vehicles now, rather than just picking on EVs? And do we think that's a viable way forward? Tim, I might come to you first.
Yeah, sure. Let's have that conversation. The Productivity Commission has been saying we should have that conversation for a decade. Let's have that conversation. But let's make it clear, what we're having right now is not that conversation. What we're having now is a specific tax on EVs. As I said before, if this was part of a much wider transition where net incentives go to EVs, even in that scenario, we'd be very happy. But we're not having that. But yeah, let's have that conversation.
Yeah. And Tim, I know you have to keep moving on to another webinar after this, so we might let you go shortly, but is there anything that you'd like to say kind of before we wrap up in case you have to leave?
Yeah, sure. I do want to make one point, which is that, and I think it's deeply cynical by all of the politicians to come out and say that this is a fight between tradies and rich Tesla drivers. I find that incredibly offensive, because I think a lot of the people we deal with on a day-to-day basis are people who try to do the right thing, who do save more to purchase electric vehicles because they believe it's right for the environment. It's a huge slap in the face for them. But also, it's important to recognise that we need a vibrant second-hand market for electric vehicles, because that second-hand market basically takes out a lot of the premium that you pay for EVs, right? So the depreciation gets taken out, but also that the people who are set to most benefit from the transition to electric vehicles are those on lower social economic incomes, because they benefit from lower running costs and lower maintenance costs. Typically, people on lower incomes drive further distances, which basically means with electric vehicles, they save more. And so by delaying EVs and affordable EVs coming to Australia, there is a cost to not doing something. So I disagree with Richard. There is a cost from kind of really being behind. We need to do something now, because if we can save those people additional transport costs, additional fuel costs, it's worth it. And so this narrative that this is only taxing rich Tesla drivers, I think it needs to be broken as well.
That's a good point. And we were talking just before this in the green room before we started. I personally have always wanted a Mini Cooper. There's no way I can afford one, nor do I want to spend that much on a new one. But they are introducing an electric one. And I figured if I start saving now, probably in 10 years when my car's ready to drop dead, I'll be able to afford a secondhand electric Mini Cooper. And there's probably heaps of people making those kinds of decisions and thinking about what they can do in the future along the same lines. And yeah, that's one thing we haven't really talked about is a secondhand electric vehicle market. Richie, do you want to tell us a little bit more about how that might operate and where that's at the moment in Australia?
So there were protections that existed, protectionist laws that prevented the importation of a large number of secondhand vehicles in Australia in order to protect the first-hand market. But now that Australia is a car taker, not a car maker, some of those rules are being eased, which is allowing the secondhand market to actually flourish a little bit further. This is great news for electric vehicles, because you can buy a secondhand EV off the Japanese auction market for half the price that you would here. And so hopefully this will see more secondhand EVs come forward, but that will take some time, and it's still a lot of work for individuals to go and find one or to go through these cooperative ones like Good Car Company. And so that's why it's also important to try and encourage fleet purchases, starting with public agencies. If people are taking action right now and writing to their state ministers, not only should they oppose the state tax, but encourage them to switch their government fleets to EVs the next time they have to purchase it, and pure electric, not just hybrid as well.
We've only got 6 minutes to go. Audrey, if you had kind of one message, what would that be very briefly to everyone on the webinar today?
Just one. Oh, look, I think we need a comprehensive electric vehicle strategy in Australia, and it needs to be backed up by appropriate policies. And we've seen from the experience in Norway what some of those policies could look like. We could be implementing fuel efficiency standards. We could be providing tax incentives for electric vehicle owners, and we shouldn't be taxing them as we are doing at the state level now.
Final word from you, Richie.
I think keep your eyes out. This future fuels strategy or discussion paper from the federal government will be coming out next month. And it's not good enough just to have a strategy if it doesn't actually propose anything worthwhile. So it's worth picking it apart and really seeing if the federal government is stepping in to coordinate and incentivize. And if not, then not only should we be writing to our state politicians, but also our federal ones as well.
Richard, final word from you.
Don't fall for the idea that every source of revenue has to be linked to a specific thing that we spend it on. If you accept that, then we're going to have turnstiles at parks any day soon. And just big picture, the point of tax for a state government, one of the objectives is to raise revenue, but a key part of any tax is to change the shape of the economy. We tax things we want to discourage. So if you want to discourage electric vehicle use, put a tax on it. If you want to encourage electric vehicles, then put a subsidy on it. It is not complicated. And what's happening now is it's all about politics, not economics, and certainly not about the budget.
And Tim, anything from you as the person actually in this market before we go today?
No, I think we've covered everything. I just want to say thank you, everyone, for their support. It means a lot to us and our company and all the people who are working our small business to see the support from the public. Gives us a bit of hope. But thanks again to everyone for coming.
No worries. Well, thank you all for joining us today. We will wrap it up there. And don't forget, we will post the links to the Australia Institute's petition to the state premiers of South Australia, New South Wales and Victoria. We'll also find that Stop the Clean Air tax petition as well. That also has links on how you can get in touch with your local and state members to lobby them about this. Thank you all for coming along today and for your excellent questions. I'm sure we didn't get to all of them. There were many, but they were a really wide variety, and I feel like we covered off on a lot of different topics. So thank you very much for that. Thank you to Tim Washington, Richard Dennis, Richie Merzian and Audrey Quicke for joining us today.
This has been a special episode of Follow the Money, and we're aiming to bring you shorter but more frequent episodes during the pandemic, so please stay tuned. You can visit tai.org.au for all our latest research and content, and we're on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. My Twitter handle is Ebony_Bennett with a NNT. Tim Washington is at EVTimOz. That's EVTimOZ. Richard Dennis is at RDNS_TAI. And Richie Merzian is at Richie Merzian. Audrey's not on Twitter. This episode was produced by Jennifer Macey, and our theme music is by Jonathan McFeat from Pulse and Thrum. And remember, keep washing those hands, wear a mask, stay safe, stay 1.5 metres away, and thanks for listening.